They gave us an opportunity to start recording in the studio with them. That was the first time.
Everybody knows the Isley Brothers, right? Between the Sheets, For the Love of You, Footsteps in the Dark, those songs defined love, soul, and even hip-hop. But here's the crazy part. The genius behind so many of those records wasn't the man in front of the mic. It was the quiet brother on the keys, Chris Jasper. Man, this dude was the architect, the one layering the harmonies, arranging the grooves, and turning simple melodies into timeless anthems. Without him, the Isley's golden era would have sounded completely different. Yet while the world praised Ronald's voice, Chris stayed in the shadows, his genius hiding in plain sight. That's the wild injustice, y'all. Chris Jasper wrote, produced, and shaped hits that still echo through generations. Caravan of Love became a graduation anthem, a wedding song, even a protest chant. And hip-hop? Rappers like Tupac, Biggie, and Ice Cube kept his work alive through samples that turned his keyboard lines into street classics. But here's the question. Why didn't he get his flowers while he was here? Why did it take his passing for so many to finally say, wow, Chris Jasper was the man behind the music? This is the story of the genius who powered the Isleys, created a sound that outlived him, and still doesn't get the credit he deserves. This is the Chris Jasper story. Let's get into it right now. Chris Jasper's story starts far away from the bright lights of fame. Born in Cincinnati, Ohio, he came up in a household where faith and music walked hand in hand. His family wasn't rich, not even close, but what they did have was discipline, community, and a belief that talent, if nurtured, could take you anywhere. From the jump, Chris gravitated toward the piano. While other kids were outside running around, he was the one sitting at the keys, hammering out scales, chords, and melodies until his fingers ached. Man, people talk about being a natural, but Chris wasn't just born with it. He put in the work. Classical training gave him a foundation, gospel gave him soul, and jazz showed him freedom. That mix, discipline, spirit, and improvisation would later become the secret sauce behind the sound he created with the Isley Brothers. You know how some folks dabble in music? Chris lived it. Every note mattered, every practice session shaped his ear, and every chord he played told him this was his purpose. Growing up in the 1960 climate of America wasn't easy. Cincinnati, like much of the country, was dealing with racial tension, economic struggle, and a world in transition. But instead of letting that break him, Chris found comfort in the piano. It was more than an instrument, it was his voice before he had the confidence to speak up. He poured frustrations, hopes, and dreams into those keys, creating sounds that made even church elders stop and say, "That boy's got something." And then came fate, the kind of connection that changes everything. Chris was close with Marvin and Ernie Isley, the younger brothers of the already famous Isley Brothers. They grew up in the same neighborhood, crossed paths at school, and bonded over music. While most folks couldn't even imagine sitting in on an Isley Brothers rehearsal, Chris was right there, sharing his ideas, blending his classical chops with their soul-driven energy. It was like the missing puzzle piece sliding into place. This wasn't just about friendship, it was about destiny. By the time Chris hit his late teens, it was clear. His life was headed straight into music. He studied formally, diving deeper into theory, arrangement, and the mechanics of sound. But the real education came from those basement jam sessions with the Isley boys. Imagine the scene, amps buzzing, guitars riffing, Chris laying down chords that glued everything together. That raw chemistry, it would soon explode into one of the most legendary runs in R&B history. See, when you listen to Chris Jasper's early story, you can't help but notice the pattern. It wasn't luck, it wasn't handed to him. It was preparation, meeting opportunity. He had the skills, the discipline, and the vision, and when the door opened to join the Isleys, he was ready to walk through it. That Cincinnati kid, the one glued to his piano bench, was about to step into the big leagues. And the music world? It would never sound the same again. When Chris Jasper officially stepped into the Isley Brothers circle, man, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. The group was already legendary with classics from the earlier years, but by the early 1970 chapter, they were ready for a rebirth. The Isleys had just expanded the lineup to include the younger brothers, Ernie and Marvin, alongside brother-in-law Chris Jasper. And that move, that's what gave birth to the iconic 3+3 album in 1973. Now, 3+3 wasn't just another record. It was a reinvention. The Isleys went from being a vocal harmony group to a fully self-contained band, writing, arranging, producing, and performing everything in-house. And right there at the center of that transformation was Chris on keyboards. His classical training and gospel roots didn't just add pretty chords, they completely reshaped the group's sound. Take That Lady. The soaring guitar from Ernie is unforgettable, but the lush keyboard layers and arrangement structure came from Chris. Or look at Summer Breeze, their reimagining of the Seals and Crofts song. The way the Isleys turned that folk track into a soulful masterpiece, that's Chris all day, adding depth, adding groove, giving it that extra heartbeat. Fans could feel it too. The Isleys' music suddenly had a richness, a sophistication that set them apart from everyone else on the charts. It wasn't just funk, wasn't just soul, wasn't just rock, it was a fusion. And Chris was the glue holding it together. And man, the momentum didn't stop there. After 3+3, they rolled out Live It Up and kept refining that formula. Each record carried that signature sound. Ronald's smooth vocals up front, Ernie's guitar blazing through, and Chris behind the keys building a sonic landscape that felt larger than life. People didn't always see him, but they sure as hell heard him. What's wild is how quickly Chris adapted. He wasn't just the new guy tagging along, he was writing, arranging, and making himself indispensable. Industry folks started to notice that the Isley Brothers had a new fire, a new energy. And fans, they couldn't get enough. That rise, the shift from vocal group to full-on band, was the first sign that Chris Jasper wasn't just another member. He was the quiet force that made the Isleys' new era possible. After the breakthrough of 3+3 and Live It Up, the Isleys weren't just hot, they were unstoppable. And at the core of that unstoppable run, Chris Jasper, man, he was more than a keyboardist. He was the architect shaping every chord progression, every lush arrangement, every layer that turned their songs into timeless masterpieces. By the mid-1970 chapter, the group had fully leaned into that new sound, funk-driven, rock-infused, but still smooth enough to melt hearts. Albums like The Heat Is On and Harvest for the World proved they weren't just a band, they were cultural architects. And if you listen closely, you'll hear Chris everywhere. Take The Heat Is On, for example. One side of the record was all groove, hard-hitting funk jams that made dance floors sweat. The other side? Straight-up bedroom ballads, smooth and intimate. That duality, that ability to shift gears without losing authenticity, came from Chris's musical direction. He knew how to balance raw energy with sophistication. That's a rare gift. Then came Harvest for the World. Man, that wasn't just music, that was a message. A call for unity, compassion, and justice, all delivered with soaring harmonies and arrangements that Chris carefully crafted. While Ronald sang the words, it was Chris's keys that gave the message its heartbeat. Turning it into more than a song, it became a movement. Fans around the world caught on. The Isleys weren't just another R&B act. They had carved out their own lane. They could sit next to Earth, Wind, and Fire in terms of scale, next to Stevie Wonder in terms of innovation, and still have their own unmistakable identity. And a big part of that identity came from Chris Jasper's ability to fuse genres. By the time Go For Your Guns dropped in 1977, the formula was unstoppable. Funk anthems like The Pride showcased their edge, while ballads like Voyage to Atlantis showed their soul. And guess who was right there, weaving it all together? Chris. His fingerprints were all over the grooves, guiding the band through new musical territories without losing that signature Isley flavor. The crazy part? Most casual fans still didn't know his name. They knew Ronald, they knew Ernie, but Chris was the quiet storm, hidden in plain sight. Yet insiders, producers, and fellow musicians recognized what was happening. They knew the Isley sound had leveled up because of Chris's presence. That run of records solidified the group as legends and proved that Chris Jasper was more than just an addition, he was the backbone of a brand new era. Every time you hear those lush keyboards, those layered harmonies, that balance between grit and grace, you're hearing Chris's vision. The rise was complete. But the crazy thing about a rise? Eventually, it leads to the next phase, the breakthrough. And for Chris Jasper, that breakthrough would take the Isleys higher than ever before, even as the spotlight still refused to shine fully on him. By the late 1970 chapter, the Isleys weren't just a successful band anymore, they were a phenomenon. And right there at the center of that phenomenon was Chris Jasper. He wasn't the one standing at the mic or shredding guitar solos, but his hands were everywhere, shaping the sound that catapulted the group to new heights. Albums like Showdown, Winner Takes All, and Go All the Way proved that the Isleys weren't slowing down one bit. They were expanding, experimenting, and dominating the charts. And while the spotlight still shined mostly on Ronald's voice and Ernie's guitar, the hidden weapon was Chris's keyboards, arrangements, and songwriting chops. Take Showdown. The funky bass lines and aggressive energy had Chris anchoring the whole record with his layered keys, giving the groove both grit and polish. Then came Winner Takes All, a massive double album. That project showed the Isleys weren't just playing the game, they were rewriting it. A double LP wasn't just ambitious, it was risky. But with Chris's vision helping to steer the arrangements, they pulled it off. Listeners got a buffet of sounds, funk, ballads, slow jams, and anthems all tied together by that signature Jasper touch. And then Go All the Way. By this point, the Isleys had mastered the formula, blend of hard funk and silky love ballads. Chris's keyboards provided the glue, his arrangements ensured no track felt unfinished, and his ear for harmony gave even the hardest grooves a sense of elegance. The fans noticed, even if they couldn't always put a name to it. People would say, "Man, the Isleys' music just sounds bigger, richer, fuller." That was Chris's magic at work. But here's the crazy part. Despite shaping these groundbreaking projects, Chris remained in the shadows. The media rarely mentioned him, critics seldom gave him equal credit, and the average listener often thought it was all Ronald. That's the bittersweet reality of being the architect instead of the face. Still, there was no denying the cultural impact. These records weren't just hits. They were part of the fabric of black culture in America. The Isleys' music blasted out of cars, filled clubs, and echoed through block parties. At the same time, their ballads became bedroom anthems, love soundtracks for couples everywhere. And behind it all was Chris, bridging worlds, funk and soul, fire and tenderness. This was the breakthrough moment, when the Isleys established themselves as more than just hitmakers. They were innovators, trendsetters, legends in real time. And Chris Jasper? He was the quiet genius ensuring the sound was bulletproof. But the biggest moment of all, the masterpiece that would define both Chris and the Isleys forever, was still on the horizon. That next chapter, the creation of Between the Sheets, would show the world just how far Chris Jasper's genius could go. If the 1,970 run proved the Isleys could reinvent themselves, the early 1,980 chapter sealed their legend. And the crown jewel of that era, Between the Sheets? Man, if you've never heard that record, you've probably still heard it sampled, flipped, remade, whispered in bedrooms, blasted in clubs. It's one of the most important R&B albums ever, and Chris Jasper's fingerprints are all over it. Let's start with the title track, Between the Sheets. That slow, seductive groove has become one of the most sampled songs in hip-hop history. The notorious B.I.G., Da Brat, Jay-Z, they all went back to it because it was just that undeniable. But here's the truth. The backbone of that song wasn't just Ronald's smooth delivery. It was Chris's lush chords, his carefully built arrangement, and that hypnotic keyboard line that still melts speakers today. Without Chris, that song doesn't exist the way we know it. Then there's Choosy Lover. Man, that ballad is so smooth it almost feels heavenly. Years later, Aaliyah covered it on her One in a Million album, proving just how timeless Chris's arrangements were. That's what genius does, it transcends decades. And let's not forget For the Love of You, Highways of My Life, and Footsteps in the Dark. Each one of those tracks is carried by Chris's ear for harmony, his ability to make keyboards sound like a full orchestra, and his instinct to let the groove breathe. Those songs became the emotional core of the Isleys' legacy, the tracks fans would play over and over again when they wanted to feel something real. The cultural impact was massive. Couples claimed these songs as our song. DJs pulled from them to set the mood. And rappers kept Chris Jasper alive long after radio stopped spinning the originals. Ice Cube's It Was a Good Day? Straight from Footsteps in the Dark. Thundercats' Them Changes? Same roots. Every time somebody flipped an Isley groove, they were really flipping Chris Jasper's genius. But here's the bittersweet twist. Even with Between the Sheets solidifying the Isleys as untouchable, Chris still didn't get the flowers he deserved. Fans screamed Ronald's name, Critics wrote about Ernie's guitar, but Chris, he was the other guy, the man in the shadows. Imagine writing and arranging some of the most iconic love songs and party anthems of all time and still being overlooked. That's crazy. Still, those who knew, knew. Musicians, producers, and die-hard fans recognized that Chris Jasper had become the engine of the group. He was the one ensuring their sound stayed fresh, relevant, and powerful. Without him, the Isleys might have faded into nostalgia. With him, they owned an entire era. Between the Sheets wasn't just a hit album, it was Chris Jasper's masterstroke, his greatest contribution to R&B, and one of the most underrated displays of genius in modern music. But as often happens, with great success came greater tension. And soon, the conflicts inside the Isley camp would push Chris to make a choice that changed everything. After Between the Sheets, the Isleys were riding high, but behind the scenes, things were starting to crack. Success can be a blessing and a curse, and for Chris Jasper, it became both. He had helped carry the group into an entirely new era, but tensions inside the family were boiling over. Money, credit, and control, those three things have broken more bands than bad record sales ever could. And man, the Isleys were no exception. By the early 1980 chapter, the group was splitting in more ways than one. The older brothers, Ronald, Rudolph, and O'Kelly, wanted to keep the spotlight, while the younger crew, Ernie, Marvin, and Chris, were feeling like their contributions weren't being respected. Think about it. Chris was writing, arranging, and producing the backbone of the music, but when the public looked at the Isleys, they only saw Ronald. That imbalance couldn't hold forever. So in 1984, Chris, Ernie, and Marvin broke away and formed their own group, Isley Jasper Isley. Now that was a bold move, but also a necessary one. They were tired of being in the background. This was their chance to step forward and prove they could hold their own. And they did. Their debut album gave us Broadway's Closer to Sunset Boulevard, but the real magic came in 1985 with Caravan of Love. Man, talk about a statement. That song wasn't just music, it was a movement. With Chris Jasper on lead vocals and keyboards, Caravan of Love became an anthem for unity, peace, and togetherness. Churches sang it, schools sang it, entire communities embraced it. In the UK, it even hit #1, proving that Chris's message resonated across oceans. For once, Chris wasn't just the man behind the sound, he was front and center, and people noticed. Fans who had never even heard his name before suddenly realized the quiet genius from the Isleys was also a powerful voice on his own. Caravan of Love was played at graduations, protests, weddings, you name it. It was the kind of song that outlived charts, becoming part of life itself. But even with that success, the cracks were still there. The group never quite escaped the shadow of the Isley Brothers, and after just a few years, Isley Jasper Isley disbanded. Still, that one anthem, that one shining moment, proved something the industry had overlooked for far too long. Chris Jasper didn't just support greatness, he was greatness. The conflict had forced him out of the Isleys, but it also gave him the platform to show the world what he could really do. Unfortunately, even after proving himself with Caravan of Love, the struggles weren't over. More battles with recognition and credit were waiting just around the corner. Even with Caravan of Love proving Chris Jasper could shine on his own, the battles were far from over. Behind the scenes, the same issues that had haunted him in the Isley Brothers continued to follow him: credit, recognition, and the constant fight to be seen as more than just the keyboard player. See, when Chris was with the Isleys, almost every major song listed all 6 members as writers. On paper, that looked fair. But in reality, Chris was carrying a huge portion of the load, building the chord progressions, arranging the harmonies, and shaping the sound that defined their golden era. He wasn't just contributing, he was driving. Yet because of the way credits were shared, his genius was diluted, buried in a list of names. That stung. And even after branching out with Isley Jasper Isley, the music industry didn't fully correct the narrative. Ronald remained the face of the brand, the one magazines and TV shows highlighted, while Chris's name still slipped through the cracks. Fans in the know respected him, but the broader public, they had no clue how deep his influence ran. And then there was the money. Shared credits meant shared royalties, and that system rarely rewarded the one doing the heavy lifting. Stories floated around about lawsuits, disputes, and family tensions that dragged on for years. The truth was simple. Chris Jasper deserved more flowers, more respect, more compensation. But in a business built on egos and contracts, fairness often came last. The craziest part? Chris never chased the fast life. He wasn't out here lost in drugs, scandals, or chaos. By all accounts, he was grounded a family man, a professional, someone who treated music as both a gift and a calling. Yet ironically, that steadiness may have worked against him in an industry that often rewards flash over substance. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, so people overlooked the quiet storm. Even after Caravan of Love, when critics should have been writing about Chris Jasper's genius, much of the attention still drifted back to Ronald. Fans online today even admit, "I had no idea Chris wrote all those songs." And that's the heartbreaking part. It took his passing for many to finally realize the truth. Only when he was gone did the flowers pour in, the tributes flood social media, and the acknowledgement finally arrive. That's the cycle, man. So many underrated legends get recognized too late. Chris Jasper lived long enough to know his impact, but he never saw the full respect he earned while he was here. His conflict wasn't just with family dynamics, it was with an entire industry that thrives on overlooking the ones who build the foundation. And yet, even in the middle of that unfairness, Chris never stopped creating. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't about charts or headlines for him, it was about the music. And that music, whether people gave him credit or not, would carry on forever. When Isley came to an end, a lot of people thought Chris Jasper might fade into the background. But man, that was never in his DNA. Chris wasn't the type to stop creating just because the spotlight shifted. He stepped out as a solo artist and carried that same musical fire with him. In 1988, he dropped his first solo record, Superbad, and the title track showed the world he still had plenty to say. Smooth grooves, sharp arrangements, and a message of confidence. It was Chris proving he could stand alone. From there, he kept releasing music consistently, building a catalog that blended R&B, gospel, and funk. His work often had spiritual undertones, a reflection of who he was as a person, grounded, faithful, and focused on something deeper than fame. He made records like One Time Love and Praise the Eternal that showed his versatility. Some leaned into the same soulful ballad lane the Isleys had mastered, while others leaned heavy into gospel, giving thanks and praise. For Chris, music wasn't just entertainment, it was expression, it was ministry, it was truth. But beyond his own records, the real legacy came in how his music lived on through others. Hip-hop and R&B artists kept sampling his work, ensuring new generations heard Chris Jasper's sound even if they didn't realize it. Tupac Shakur's It's a Good Day, straight from Footsteps in the Dark. The notorious B.I.G. is Big Papa, that's Between the Sheets. Ice Cube, Jay-Z, UGK, Destiny's Child, Aaliyah, Thundercat. So many artists across decades tapped into Chris's grooves to build their own hits. That's not just influence, that's immortality. Think about that reach. You've got a kid in the 1990 chapter discovering Cube's It Was a Good Day, vibing out, not realizing they're listening to Chris Jasper's melody underneath. You've got fans of Aaliyah in the 2000 chapter hearing Choosy Lover on 1 in a Million and feeling something timeless without knowing its origin. You've got modern artists like Thundercat flipping Footsteps in the Dark into Them Changes, keeping Chris's genius alive for Gen Z. That's impact across 4 decades, man. And don't forget, Caravan of Love. Even outside the hip-hop world, that song became more than music. It was sung at graduations, used in churches, blasted at rallies for peace. In the UK, it topped charts, on cruise ships, in school gyms, even in commercials that chorus carried forward. Every time a crowd sang, "Join the Caravan of Love," Chris Jasper's spirit was right there. What makes this legacy even more powerful is the fact that Chris never stopped being himself. He didn't chase trends, didn't sell out his values. He kept making the kind of music that spoke to him, whether or not it was topping Billboard. And because of that, his catalog has a timeless quality. You can drop one of his tracks today, and it still feels fresh, still feels soulful, still feels alive. Chris Jasper may not have gotten the headlines, but through samples, covers, and the sheer endurance of his songwriting, he became woven into the DNA of modern music. His solo work, his gospel records, and his fingerprints on hip-hop classics ensured that even without the spotlight, his sound would never die. Chris Jasper's story is bittersweet because his legacy kept growing even while recognition lagged behind. For years, his name wasn't front and center, but the music refused to be silenced. And when people finally looked back, especially after his passing, they realized just how much of the Isley Brothers' golden sound had his fingerprints all over it. Fans online said it best, "I had no idea Chris wrote all those songs." That kind of revelation tells you how underrated he really was. While Ronald Isley was celebrated as the voice and Ernie as the guitar wizard, Chris was the architect of harmony, the man who made those records sound so lush, so timeless. Without his touch, the Isley's catalog would not have carried the same weight. Over time, critics started to acknowledge him more. The Songwriters Hall of Fame and other institutions gave Chris his due, even if it came later than it should have. But the real recognition? It came from the countless artists who borrowed from his work. From Whitney Houston's jazzy take on For the Love of You, to Aaliyah covering Choosy Lover, to rappers flipping his grooves into hip-hop anthems, Chris's influence proved inescapable. He may not have been the headline star, but he was the foundation everyone kept building on. And when you compare him to other underrated giants like Babyface in his early years, or Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis before Janet Jackson blew them up, or even Teddy Riley before the New Jack Swing explosion, you see the same pattern. These are the architects, the ones behind the curtain, the ones shaping soundtracks for entire generations while others take the spotlight. Chris belonged in that club, no doubt about it. His music wasn't just influential, it was eternal. Caravan of Love kept being sung decades after it was released, uniting strangers in gyms, churches, and rallies. Between the Sheets became a hip-hop cornerstone. Footsteps in the Dark never left the culture. That kind of endurance doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the music was built to last, because it carried truth, emotion, and craftsmanship at the highest level. The sad truth, though, is that so much of this acknowledgement came after Chris was gone. Only then did tributes pour in. Only then did people start saying his name with the respect it always deserved. That's the curse of being underrated too often. The flowers arrive when the artist can no longer smell them. But here's the beauty. Chris Jasper's music ensures he'll never truly be forgotten. Every time a rapper samples one of his grooves, every time a couple dances to an Isley ballad, every time a choir belts out Caravan of Love, his spirit is alive and well. His legacy isn't locked in the past, it's woven into the present and future of music. And maybe that's the greatest tribute of all. Titles fade, awards collect dust, but sound lasts forever. Chris Jasper's sound, the harmonies, the keys, the arrangements will outlive all of us. Underrated? Not question. But unforgettable? Absolutely. When we look back at the story of Chris Jasper, it's hard not to feel a mix of admiration and frustration. Admiration because the man was a musical genius, a true architect of sound who gave the Isley Brothers their richest era, and then went on to create timeless music on his own. Frustration because he never got the flowers he deserved while he was here. His name should have been spoken in the same breath as Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, or Babyface. Instead, it was too often tucked in the credits, hidden behind the spotlight that stayed on others. But that's the thing about legacy, it doesn't care about headlines. It lives in the grooves of the records, in the melodies sampled by new generations, in the voices of fans who still sing his songs decades later. Chris Jasper's music refuses to be forgotten. From Between the Sheets to Caravan of Love, from the bedrooms to the block parties, his sound is part of the DNA of black music, American music, global music. So we have to ask, why do we wait until it's too late? Why do geniuses like Chris only get their full recognition after they're gone? That's a question the industry and all of us need to sit with. Because Chris deserved better. He deserved to hear people say, "You changed the game." Still, his story isn't just one of missed credit, it's one of enduring impact. He may have been underrated, but he was never under-talented. His work still speaks, still moves, still inspires. And in that way, Chris Jasper beat the system. He outlived the politics of the industry. His music will live forever. Rest in peace, Chris Jasper. Underrated? Absolutely. But unforgettable, untouchable, and forever respected in the hearts of those who know the truth.